Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine for the Nintendo 64 is, appropriately enough, a game with a complex history. Winding up as a limited production exclusive for the N64, it saw its share of victories and hard knocks just like its title character. The question is, does it belong in a museum, or should it be lost to time? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. It's hard not to talk about Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine without talking about the circumstances surrounding its release. See, Indy was released on the N64 in late 2000, early 2001. With the GameCube looming on the horizon and the N64 on life support at that point, LucasArts struggled to, and ultimately were unable to, find a single retail store which would carry the game as a new release. This info comes from no less than Nintendo Power, so you know the situation was dire when they're saying stuff like that. What happened because of this is that Indy became a limited production exclusive available to rent only at Blockbuster Video, and only sold on the LucasArts and Blockbuster websites. And that's how I first encountered the game. Sort of. Back in 2004, I had stopped at a tiny Blockbuster Video location in Winnipeg right before they were closing for the night. In their used games for sale section, I found a complete in-box copy of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine for $20. It was in good condition too, which suggests that it wasn't really rented all that much. Being the dumb kid that I was at the time, I let myself get talked out of getting it in favor of picking up donuts instead. Considering a complete in-box copy now goes for, I'm sorry, how much? And a bear card is sitting around the $100 mark? Ahem. Considering a boxed copy goes for about the price of a monthly car payment now, I regret my decision. But hey, hindsight and all. Either way, I figured that I had forever lost my opportunity to play Indy on original hardware. Then I had a conversation with Mark over at geekguilt.com. If the name Geek Guilt sounds familiar, that's because we've looked at some of their custom N64 games before, such as Dragon Ball Kart 64 and Slasher Kart 64. Because they offer a variety of games flashed to N64 carts, including every Game Boy and Game Boy Color Pokemon game, yes, including Pokemon Pinball, Link's Awakening DX, and homebrews like Slasher Kart and Simpson Kart 64, which, let me know in the comments if you want a video on that one, we were talking about other possible games which could be put on N64 carts. There was one Game Boy Color game in particular that I had suggested, but we'll keep vague in case it actually happens. And then I realized that it might be possible to make repro carts of, say, a game lost to time and narrow exclusivity. Mark said he'd consider it, and we left it at that. A little while later, he sent me a really generous care package of games, and in that box, I discovered exactly what I had asked for: an Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine repro cart. I could finally play the game on original hardware. So yeah, all of the gameplay footage here was recorded on original hardware, using that repro cart and a Level Hike N64 HDMI cable. Oh, and the video is sponsored by Geek Guilt as a result, because this was too cool a collaboration for it not to happen. So thank you, Geek Guilt, for both sponsoring this video and this golden opportunity. But is it such a golden opportunity? Was Indy worth the 20-year wait? Well, yes and no, but we'll get into that. First things first though, we need to clarify a few things. To start, the rough circumstances Infernal Machine encountered on release, in terms of distribution and gameplay, we'll get to that in a moment, were not entirely unfamiliar territory for our intrepid archaeologist. Indy had a largely difficult go with console games to that point, and arguably since. I'm looking at you, Staff of Kings. The 1983 Atari 2600 adaptation of Raiders of the Lost Ark is notoriously esoteric, but that's because it was overly ambitious for the hardware it was on. No surprise, because it was made by Howard Scott Warshaw of Atari 2600 ET fame/infamy. The next console release wouldn't be until 1989 with Tengen's port of the Atari-made Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom arcade game to the NES. While the devs expanded on the gameplay to try to make it more than just a simple arcade port, it too was arguably overly ambitious for the hardware, leading to some less than ideal controls. The fact that it was a Tengen game also affected it, considering this was right when Nintendo was strong-arming retailers to keep them from carrying unlicensed NES cards. Then we got not one, but two tries at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, licensed this time, one from Taito in 1991 and one from Ubisoft in 1993. These games are significantly different from one another, but that doesn't make either one of them good. And I played as much as I could of both of them, before just needing to turn them off. The one console attempt, this is an important distinction that we'll get to in a moment, prior to Infernal Machine, which really captured the spirit of Dr. Jones, is Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures for the SNES. Released in the wake of the Super Star Wars trilogy, it clearly owes a lot to those games, except with all of the indie movies compressed into a single game, rather than their own fully fleshed out individual releases. This game is also important to Infernal Machine, but we'll come back to that. The second thing we need to talk about is that Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine is not an original N64 game. It is a port of the PC game of the same name from 1999. For the longest time, the PC game was considered abandonware, until it was re-released back onto GOG and Steam within the past few years. That means that the PC version of the game is readily accessible, and for only a few dollars. The thing is that while the N64 port is the same as the PC game in broad strokes, the plot, the level layout and order, and so on, there were also significant changes made in order to adapt the game for a console audience. Specifically a Nintendo one. Even more specifically, the devs in charge of porting the game to the system took cues from some of Nintendo's biggest hits for the N64 to that point. For instance, the load game / stage select screen looks almost identical to the same menu from GoldenEye. More importantly, the control scheme was entirely overhauled to cater to audiences who would have been more familiar with Ocarina of Time. Items can be mapped to 3 of the 4 C buttons, although there are complications that we'll get into, and the game offers something that the PC original did not: auto-aim. More to the point, the N64 port features a variation on the Z targeting from Ocarina of Time, something that reviewers of the time said made the combat much easier to navigate than the PC original. I say a variation because the lock-on targeting here is, let's be nice and say not as polished as the one found in Zelda. It can lose lock-on super easily, and the auto-aim gets disrupted if Indy has to do simple things like, turn slightly. Combine this with the fact that Indy just will not target threats like lions and other large animals, and that the whip is kind of useless other than for stunning enemies, and the combat is less engaging than it could or should be. This leads to a larger issue with the game, and something they really should have borrowed from another Nintendo-made N64 game, Super Mario 64. See, what this game really needed, more than items mapped to the C buttons, was camera controls, which could have been mapped to either the C buttons or, the D-pad or something. Seriously, the camera is going to be one of your worst enemies in this game, because it does not provide the best angle a lot of the time, leading to jumps where you cannot gauge the distance, causing instant deaths, getting attacked by enemies you cannot see and Indy cannot lock onto, not being able to tell where platforms end or begin, and more. Considering a good 80% of the game's action is platforming and environment navigation, this is a huge problem. But it's not the only one. There are issues with the controls in general. See, while there are aspects of the controls which borrow from other N64 games, Infernal Machine's heaviest influence is actually a PS1 game. Infernal Machine plays like nothing less than an attempt at a Tomb Raider game for the N64. This is fair both because the N64 never actually received a Tomb Raider game to call its own, and because, let's be honest, Tomb Raider was so heavily and blatantly inspired by the Indiana Jones movies that it's kind of surprising that Lara never donned a fedora prior to the 2012 reboot. The problem is that Indy does not control like Lady Croft though. Part of the issue is that Tomb Raider, despite being in 3D, essentially operates on a tiered 2D grid system. Each element occupies one or more grid spaces, and Lara's movements are measured by the same grid spaces. This makes jumps easy to gauge and measure, as the player knows how many grid spaces Lara can jump, versus the distance before her, again measured in grid spaces. Indy doesn't have that luxury. In fact, Indy's jumps are inconsistent and kind of floaty. Nowhere emphasizes this issue more than in the Palawan Temple halfway through the game. In the temple, there is a section where Indy and the player have to jump from platform to platform, floating in lava, with some of the platforms sinking and resurfacing. This section legit almost made me rage quit. It combines Indy's awkward jumping mechanics and the terrible camera with disappearing platforms straight out of Mega Man 2, all over instant death in the form of the lava pool. It literally took me 2 hours worth of tries to be able to get across it the first time, and the player is expected to cross it multiple times to complete the level. On the whole though, there are several spots in the game which, because of the jumps combined with the camera, take a lot longer than they should. The Palawan Temple is just the worst of it. Going back to Nintendo Power, in their Now Playing review, Chris, whose last name isn't given anywhere in the issue, said, quote, "The play control is brutal without camera controls. and he's not wrong. This actually plays into another issue with the game, the raft level. The effin' raft level. In this level, Indy has to use a rubber raft to negotiate the rapids of the Tianshan River, and the controls are not great. Turning is incredibly slow, you have to hold a button and direction to move forward, and in addition to the camera issues already present, the raft can spin wildly when it hits particularly turbulent portions of the rapids. This quickly makes this portion of the game disorienting and possibly nauseating. If you have motion sickness issues at all, you are going to have a bad time. Oh, right, on top of all of that, any brushes against any rocks, and the raft will spring a leak. For which the player is only given one patch kit. Period. If you don't fix it, the raft then has a timer attached to it. If you're still in the water when the timer runs out, Indy automatically drowns. To be fair, the timer resets anytime the player gets out of the water. I guess Indy reinflates the raft each time he uses it, but unless you use the patch kit, it will still slowly deflate whenever you get back in. There are other vehicle levels in the game, which are considerably more enjoyable. For instance, there's the Jeep level, which allows Indy and the player to jump across gorges in the Jeep using ramps and run over Soviet soldiers firing at them. My only question is how the Jeep is so fragile that 5 hits from an enemy rifle will make it explode like a propane tank. Then there are the minecarts, which are ripped right out of Temple of Doom, and okay, LucasArts, I see what you did there. The minecarts, the rubber raft, giving the player the vehicles from Temple of Doom in a playable form. Well done. This leads to something we've been dancing around for most of the video. See, while LucasArts themselves developed the original PC version of the game, they were not directly responsible for the N64 port. Instead, porting duties were given over to Factor 5. For those unfamiliar, Factor 5 is, or rather was, an originally German game studio which relocated to the US in the mid-90s precisely because of their close working relationship with LucasArts. They are responsible for such games as the Turrican series and the Rogue Squadron games for both the N64 and GameCube. Rogue Leader is still one of the best Star Wars games of all time, fight me, before being shuttered after the disastrous performance of the PS3 title Lair. Thanks, shoehorned 6-axis controls! Most relevant to this video though, remember how he said that the best console game Indy had gotten to this point was Indiana Jones's Greatest Adventures? Yeah, that was Factor 5, which means that Dr. Jones should have been in good hands. Here's the thing though, from what I could find, this port was not handled by the whole Factor 5 team. This kind of makes sense given the release window. They were also pushing to get Rogue Leader out for the GameCube launch at the same time, which, you know what? That's fair. However, it looks like the port was tackled by a team of just 8 people. And you can kinda tell. What I mean is that this is the buggiest N64 game I have ever played. During my playthrough, there were numerous instances of Indy clipping through objects and getting stuck, requiring me to reload my save game. There were also plenty of times assets and textures just didn't appear. The worst example of this being the Aztec jungle, where none of the textures loaded, leaving the level feeling like a dev build. Then there are the instances where the game hard-locked my N64, and I had to turn the system off and then on again. Something I have never experienced with any other N64 game. I don't know, it may be because I'm using the expansion pack, or because it's a repro cart and it's an issue with the ROM used, which is 100% not Geek Guilt's fault. Either way, bugs, not snakes, were my biggest fear when playing as Indy. It's odd that this is the case since the devs were building this port on a modified version of the Dark Forces 2 engine, which was 3 years old at that point, and wait, hold on a damn minute. Are you seriously telling me that we came this close to getting an N64 port of Jedi Knight? Oh, what could have been? I mean, anyway. So yeah, the game definitely has issues, and a more than small amount of bugs. And I know it sounds like I hated the experience, but I really didn't for a few reasons. First, again, this was the closest we would ever get to a proper Tomb Raider game on the N64, which, considering what came before, absolutely makes this the best console indie game to be released to that point. Part of the reason for that is how it captures the feel of the movies and the character. For one thing, Indy is regularly making quips and remarks about the situations he finds himself in, and the behavior of his companions.
Good news never travels that fast. This looks interesting. Uh-oh, that was fast. Maybe I need some help with this. Okay, Sophia, I found the key.
Took you long enough.
Be nice, or I won't use it.
Sure, it's not actually Harrison Ford delivering the lines, but this was 1999 to 2002. Video games hadn't gotten mainstream enough for that yet. Besides, Doug Lee, Indy's voice actor, does a passable enough impression, just like he did in the best PC indie game to be released to that point, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Oh, right, that's another thing. Infernal Machine is a direct follow-up to Fate of Atlantis, with returning characters and a setting that takes Indy past World War II into the early days of the Cold War. A good 8 years before they tried it with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which is not the only similarity between Infernal Machine and Crystal Skull, but we'll get there. While I appreciate the direct follow-up to Fate of Atlantis, the writing kind of just assumes you've played the prior PC-only game. Because of this, if you aren't already aware of, say, who Sophia Hapgood is, or why she thinks she has psychic powers, you're gonna be kinda lost. That doesn't fully diminish the adventurous feeling of playing through the game, though. Indy and the player travel to all of the exotic locations expected of a proper entry in the franchise. From Iraq to Sudan, to Kazakhstan by way of China, to Peru and the Philippines, this plays like a true globe-spanning adventure, right down to the game's intertitles showing the maps with the traveling red lines straight from the movies. More than that, all of the locations are tied to historically accurate sites, or ruins, or people. For instance, while people may have a mythologized perception of it, Babylon was an actual city in what is now known as Iraq, and that Nebuchadnezzar II, whom the game claims built the titular infernal machine for the ancient god Marduk, was real and served as ruler of Babylon from 605 to 562 BCE. Marduk was real as well, sort of, but we'll come back to him in a moment. Let's put a pin in that discussion for now. First though, getting back to the game feeling like a proper indie adventure, for all of the complaining I did for the, quirks in the platforming gameplay, there are definitely moments where it just clicks and you absolutely feel like Dr. Jones. In particular, while the whip may be kind of useless for combat, there is no denying the thrill of using it to latch onto a beam or overhang and then swinging across an otherwise impassable chasm or gap, Raiders of the Lost Ark style, right down to the sound of the cracking whip and the Indiana Jones overture. Then there's a piece of equipment Indy has that Lara didn't, at least during that initial Tomb Raider cycle. The machete. Again, straight out of Temple of Doom. Sure, the machete is useful in combat, but its main use is for clearing vines and spiderwebs, allowing for further exploration and discovery of hidden areas. As with the whip, there is something thrilling and just Jones-like about using it. Oh, and it is the only item that can be used to fight off sharks, piranhas, and crocodiles in the various bodies of water Indy has to swim through, so there's that, too. There are other sound effects which feel out of place, though. For instance, why is there a cash register noise whenever Indy grabs a hidden artifact?
Aha!
Yeah, the museum paid him for the pieces he brought in. Brody says as much at the beginning of Raiders, but he was never a treasure hunter. That was the entire point of the opening to Last Crusade. Also, the sound when Indy grabs an item is the most generic stock MIDI of the 90s. Seriously, listen to this.
Look what I found. I think it's a key.
On the plus side though, the game is fully voiced. It isn't just random Indy quips Doug Lee is delivering.
Sophia, what are you doing here?
Same thing you are. I found the door. Let's go.
All of the cutscenes feature a full voice cast, which is itself kind of impressive for the N64. Okay, now that we've covered all of that, let's discuss Marduk, because what the devs did with him is where the indie feeling of the game falters the most, especially considering the period of the game's release. See, Marduk was, as with Shiva and Kali in Temple of Doom and the Judeo-Christian god in Raiders and Last Crusade, an actual historical god from the Babylonian period. The thing is, unlike any of the movie trilogy to that point, Infernal Machine does not treat Marduk as a supernatural entity. Instead, the devs try to offer a scientific explanation, more along the lines of Doctor Who than Dr. Jones. What I mean by this is that, while Marduk does exist in the world of the game, he is not an actual god, but an extra-dimensional being, much like the aliens in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. This point is hammered home in the final stage when Jones and the player are sucked into Marduk's dimension and have to navigate otherworldly areas leading to a confrontation with the erstwhile god. The ways this notion of Marduk as extra-dimensional being manifests in-game feel out of place for an Indiana Jones story, and comes across more like a video gamey checklist than anything else. For example, that final level feels more like a direct response to the success of Half-Life than anything from the Indiana Jones trilogy. I also say this because for all of the supernatural and mysticism in the Indiana Jones mythos, there also tends to be a subtlety present to the proceedings. Yeah, I know, subtle and Indiana Jones don't seem to go hand in hand, but hear me out though. Across all of the original trilogy of movies, the supernatural stays in the background, only making its presence known during the third act of each film, with the notable exception of the heart extraction in Temple of Doom. Even then, the gods mentioned never directly make an appearance, only their influence is felt. Here though, not only does Indy fight Marduk directly, as we've already discussed, but the parts of the Infernal machine act as reusable tools/weapons, and most video gamey of all, there are giant monstrous level bosses Indy has to fight throughout. Not only are there stereotypical ice and lava monsters, but a giant snake in the form of Quetzalcoatl, and a giant robot? Why is there a giant robot? This is like the force field generator in Everything or Nothing. Incredibly out of place for the franchise, but video games. So, yeah. It looks like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull has some precedent after all. Especially since... Wait, is Infernal Machine canon? I'm not sure. I couldn't find a definitive answer, one way or the other. Considering everything I just mentioned, I suspect not, but... Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And the fact that Fate of Atlantis is canon because it's referenced in that movie. Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine is a complicated game to discuss. The strange circumstances around its development for the N64, the bugs and glitches which resulted, and the awkward relationship with the source material all make for, let's call it, an uneven experience. However, because of its limited release, its major adaptations for the specific console it was ported to, and some undeniable Indiana Jones moments, it is still a fascinating glimpse into the era of its release, the twilight of the N64, and a seeming gap period for Indiana Jones media. While there are better Indiana Jones games out there, which we will definitely be looking at in a future episode, there is still enough here to make video game archaeologists sit up and take notice, which makes it a good weekend rental.